Hello, and welcome back to my Stoa Starman video challenge, in which I attempt to make as many videos as possible in the month of January. This is day 18 and video number 13, so I'm doing all right. I initially wanted to make a video every day, and I have not been able to accomplish that, but I'm doing it most days. Today I'm going to be talking about cemeteries and graveyards, the differences between those two, and the how we look at burial has changed over the years. Um, so, what is the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard? Well, a graveyard is typically smaller. It is affiliated with a particular church or a particular religion, and is um, often found on the actual grounds of that church. The being either a member of that church or a person who believes in that faith is required in order to be buried there, typically. However, cemeteries, on the other hand, are larger. They are not affiliated with a particular church or a particular religion. They're generally affiliated with a community. They're There are no belief requirements for burial there. They are open to people of all faiths. So, why did we move from having graveyards to cemeteries? Well, to begin with, graveyards, as we typically think of them, started in the 600s. People were buried typically in mass graves until they were fully decomposed, at which point their skeletal remains were exhumed and then reposited permanently in ossuaries or in catacombs. There were certain health concerns associated with that practice. There was concerns about the bodies decomposing within the city. There's often an issue with smell in the area. And as cities grew, there was a problem with lack of space, especially during times when there were widespread disease outbreaks and there was a need for many people to be buried within a fairly short period of time. Again, the smell was often an issue, and they would often have to open up the areas where people were interred if they were not buried for a while to let the scent out and the air in, as the decomposition process often resulted in there not being enough oxygen in the space. Again, that's where they were interred as opposed to buried. And so because of those issues, in 1711, an architect by the name of Christopher Wren designed what are known as garden cemeteries or rural cemeteries. As opposed to graveyards, garden cemeteries were by design outside of the city, thereby eliminating the issues with smell and with any health concerns affiliated. They were large open spaces of land surrounded by a wall and with a gate. There was intended to be a feeling of leaving the living world behind and entering another place when you passed through the grand gates. The burial plots in garden cemeteries were intended to be permanent rather than exhuming the skeletal remains at some point. They would plant trees. They would have statues. People would build grand mausoleums in addition to ornate gravestones and monuments. These became essentially the first public parks. They were one of the few places where poor people could actually go and see statues. And they were also wide open public land where people could walk and meet and admire the sculpture of the statues and the mausoleums and the monuments. It was not uncommon for people to have picnics in the cemeteries during this time period. It was not uncommon for concerts to be put on in these areas, in these cemeteries. People used to even race their carriages down the pathways, and they were actually a really great place for the community to come together. In addition to remembering the dead, they were also a place for the living to gather and to build their community. They were the first real public parks. What we now think of as public parks didn't come about till much later. In the 1850s, an alternative system of cemetery design was proposed by Adolf Strauch. I am probably butchering that name. I apologize, I do not speak German. He was a landscape architect, and he designed what is known as a lawn cemetery, as opposed to a garden cemetery. The focus of lawn cemeteries is not on the individual monuments and individual grave markers of individual people or individual families. Instead, the design focuses on the appearance of the cemetery as a whole. And so there would be a great degree of uniformity in the grave markers. There would not be grand mausoleums. You would have either plaques or headstones, and there would be regulations on how big, what shapes they could be. This had certain advantages over the garden cemeteries of the earlier years of the 1700s. For one thing, they were more efficient uses of the land space. You could have more graves per square acre. They were easier to mow and maintain. And because of all of those factors, they also were cheaper to maintain, which means that it was cheaper for people to be buried there. One of the unfortunate problems with garden cemeteries is while that it was free for the public to go and to spend time there, it was very expensive to be buried there. So this, leads to more of what we think of cemeteries today. Graves are typically laid out in, straight rows, uniformly spaced. There may be some variation in grave marker, but there are limits to how large they can be. And again, this makes it easier to maintain and cheaper to manage. and that in turn makes it cheaper for someone to be buried there. In more recent years, we've had a little bit more of a cultural shift in a different direction. People are more concerned about the environment. And one of the problems with how we have historically handled burial is that the chemicals used in preservation are horrible for the environment, and on top of that, the well-maintained, well-manicured spaces that cemeteries had become are not really conducive to the development of the natural landscape or the preservation of the natural landscape. You know, you have to cut down trees, you have to plant grass, you are going to be discouraging animals from living there. And so nowadays, there has been a recent move towards natural burial. In a natural burial scenario, the body is typically not placed in a coffin or a casket, but is rather simply wrapped in a shroud. There are some caskets and coffins that can be used, but typically there's some restriction on that, and much of the time it's just the shroud. I have seen some woven basket-like caskets for use in natural burial. And these natural burial cemeteries, they typically do not have any grave marker of any kind. Instead, a GPS location is taken of where the gravesite is so that it can be found later when the family wants to come to visit the grave. The area then is allowed to develop naturally. Plants grow wild, animals come through. No hazardous chemicals are used. And so the cemetery then becomes, in a sense, sort of a nature preserve over time. And so it's very interesting. I do like that it is more environmentally friendly. Unfortunately, we use a lot of very unfortunate chemicals when we embalm bodies. And so they're terrible for the environment. They get into the soil, and it's ultimately bad for the environment and bad for us in the long run. However, the entire lack of grave marking I don't like very much. I like the idea of having a grave marker that people can go and see and read and find out about, their ancestors. I personally prefer the garden style cemetery. I have visited some of them. Rather nice one I went to was the Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, Rhode Island. Absolutely beautiful. A lot of historic people buried there, but it's a beautiful space. You can walk around. They have little signs telling you what all the trees are. And it looks like a place where you would want to go and have a picnic. And one of the cultural shifts that went along with the change between the Victorian era garden cemeteries and the more modern lawn cemeteries and natural burial cemeteries is that we are less and less prone to visit cemeteries, even to visit the graves of people we know. Most people only go to cemeteries for funerals, and that's about it. The garden cemeteries of, you know, years gone by encouraged people to return and visit. You wanted to go back there. It was a nice place. It was a place you wanted to be. The lawn cemeteries are far more industrial in their feel. They're a lot more practical, but less welcoming. And the natural burial, again, it's natural, and that's wonderful. So ultimately, it's kind of a personal preference thing. But yes, I do prefer the garden cemeteries. I've enjoyed them immensely. But anyway, I found that interesting. I hope you did as well. So as part of the challenge, now I'm going to pick my next topic out of the hat. And my next topic is Cher Ami, the spy pigeon. That should be interesting. I know that name, and I know that it is a spy pigeon or a famous war pigeon, but I don't know the details about that, so I'm interested in finding out more. And I hope you'll join me for that. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, you know how YouTube works, you know what to click down there, and I hope to see you again sometime. Till then, thanks for watching, and stay spooky.